Hi guys, and welcome back. In today's video, we will be doing a summary of topic 6 of paper 2, which is Geographical Investigations. During your GCSE geography course, you will have gone out on 2 field trips, one for physical geography and the other for human geography. The 2 trips and the classwork you covered around this is what will be examined in section C of paper 2. At the end of this video, I will do a run through of the structure of the exam and some of the questions or things to expect. I'm also currently finishing off the slides for paper 3 and will upload those soon. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you're notified when I post them. Okay, let's get started. For the physical part of our fieldwork investigations, we are going to be using rivers as our example. And the title is Investigating River Processes and Management. So there are several steps that we need to follow when planning an investigation. So before we go out to the field, the first thing that we need to do is to develop an inquiry question. Now, this is the question that we will be seeking to answer when we go out to the field. And then the second thing that we will need to do is to think about the methods that we are going to use to collect primary data. Now, primary data is obviously the data that you collect, that you yourself collects. Then thirdly, we are going to find good secondary data. And this is the data that was collected previously by other people. You're going to try and figure out what sources of good data there are out there that will help you to answer that inquiry question that you have set. Then fourth, you need to think about your data presentation. So once you have collected all your data and you have come back from the field, obviously in your case you've come back to school, you'll need to think about how you're going to present that data. Are you going to use, what kind of graphs are you going to use, or maps, and so on. Then fifth, you will then need to analyze that data. Analyzing the data obviously will be after you have presented it. So you will analyze it, say what that data is showing you, and begin to draw conclusions. Now, those conclusions will be answering the question or the inquiry question that you set at the very beginning. Then the last thing that you will need to do is to evaluate and to reflect on your inquiry. And then also making suggestions is another thing that you do towards the end of your fieldwork investigation. So the first thing to do is to develop the inquiry question like we saw on the last slide. And it's not just developing that inquiry question, it's also about thinking about sub-questions that will help you to support that particular question. Now, the inquiry question sometimes is likely to be quite broad, and therefore you'll need to break it down into at least 3 parts, which obviously is what we are referring to as sub-questions. So 3 sub-questions to support that main inquiry question. And then we will need to come up with hypotheses for these sub-questions. Now, hypotheses are what we expect to find when we go out into the field as an answer to those particular questions that we have set. So when developing an inquiry question for a river investigation, it will be prudent, first of all, to remind ourselves of the features of a river and that are covered in the Bradshaw model. So as you can see here, this is the Bradshaw model, and you have the features of the river in the upstream as well as in the downstream. Now, you can see that this here, this first part here is on the discharge of the river, and the discharge of the river is the amount of water that is in the river channel and that is passing through a particular point at a given time. So in the upstream, the Bradshaw model stipulates that you will expect to find less discharge in the river, and then that discharge of the river will increase as you go downstream, and that's why this here widens as you go downstream. Then you have the occupied channel width, which is another feature of the river, and in the upstream that will be quite narrow, and then as you go downstream, it's going to widen, so the occupied channel will become wider. And then the same for the depth. The depth in the upstream will be, the river will be a lot shallower. And then as you move towards the downstream, the depth of that river channel is going to increase. Average velocity the same. The river is going to get faster. And then the load quantity is the amount of material that river is carrying, and that is also going to increase as you travel downstream. And you're expecting that to happen because the river will have been doing a lot of erosion as it goes along, and by the time it's getting downstream, it will have picked up a lot of sediment or load quantity or material, and that material obviously will be carried along in the flow of the water. So there are a couple of features though that actually become smaller as you go downstream, and that one of those is the load particle size. And the load particle size refers to the size, obviously, of the material that is being carried by a river. And that will decrease as you go downstream due to processes such as attrition, where the material is hitting against each other, or the boulders are hitting against each other and getting smaller, breaking into smaller pieces and becoming well-rounded and so on. And then the channel bed roughness will also get smoother as you go downstream. And that's likely because the river is faster, so the average velocity is faster, and therefore more erosion will be taking place as you go downstream, and the channel the riverbed, the channel bed will be a lot smoother because of the erosion and the scraping, like abrasion and so on, that is taking place. It will make the channel a lot smoother. Okay, slope gradient the same as well. You expect that in the upper course it's likely to be quite steep and hilly, and then as you get downstream it's likely to be a lot flatter. So what's an example of an investigation question? So an investigation question would be, for example, investigating how river characteristics change with distance downstream. Okay, so if we're investigating river characteristics and how they change, then clearly we will need to use this Bradshaw model to pick out what features of the river we would like to study when we go out to the field. Okay, and since this is quite a broad question, we will need to break it down into further sub-questions, and I've put some examples here. So how does the width of the river change with distance downstream? Now, that obviously we know according to this model. Let's find the width. So that's the width here. We expect that it's going to increase as we go downstream. But then when we go out into the field, we will be able to either prove or disprove that particular theory. Okay. And then going on to another sub-question we could ask is, how does the depth of the river change with distance downstream? And then lastly, how does the velocity of the river change with distance downstream? After that, we would then, using what we know from our study on rivers, including the Bradshaw model, create a hypothesis for each of the questions. And the hypothesis is a prediction of what we will expect to find. And for our first sub-question, for example, the hypothesis we could come up with is that the width of the river will increase with distance downstream. So we are expecting that that river width is going to increase. And then second one for the second sub-question, the depth of the river will increase and the velocity of the river will increase with distance downstream. So those are three hypotheses that we've come up based on our sub-questions that we have created to support our main inquiry question. So after designing the inquiry question, the sub-questions and the hypotheses, we will now design our inquiry. Now the inquiry will have qualitative and quantitative data, and we will also need to think about what sampling methods we need to use. So a fieldwork investigation requires that you collect your own primary data. You therefore must think about your sample size and survey locations. So your sample size here is referring to how many sets of data you want to collect. So you could, for example, say that you're going to stop in 3 places or 4 places or 5 places along the course of that particular river to collect your sample from, or to collect your data, your primary data from. But you also need to think about your survey locations. So where on that particular river course are you going to stop for those 4 or 5 or 3 sets of data that you want to collect? And the data that you will collect will either be quantitative, so quantitative data is numerical data, which involves numbers, or is qualitative, so non-numerical data. And to determine your survey locations for your quantitative data, you can choose from 3 types of sampling methods. So 3 ways of deciding where you're going to stop along that river course to collect that data, that primary data. And the first method that we're going to be discussing here is the random method of sampling, right over here. Now here you collect data from anywhere, along that river course. This removes bias. But the problem is that it might not be representative. Because you chose the sites randomly, it might not represent the entire course of the river, for example. Okay, so that's a random sampling method. And then the second sampling method here is systematic sampling. Now here you will work to a system. So for example, you could collect data every 5 meters, or you could collect data every 3 meters, and so on. Now, this also removes bias, but then may also not be representative. Then finally, we have stratified sampling. Now, this is collecting data from different parts. So for example, in this case, you can collect data in the upper course, and then go to the middle course, which is there, and then go to the lower course. So that is stratified, and this here is more representative, but it's biased because you have predetermined where you're going to be collecting that data from. Now, it's very important to remember these 3 types of sampling because you're likely to be asked about them in the examination, and also to remember the advantages and disadvantages of each in case you're asked. And then it's also important for you to remember what quantitative methods are, their advantage, and then what qualitative methods of data collection are as well. So what about qualitative data then? So there are several ways of collecting qualitative data. And one of the things that you can do is to draw a field sketch, right? So you can decide what part of the river you want to do a field sketch for, and then you will stop there and do a sketch of that particular section. Or secondly, you could take photos or videos. And in fact, if you were to take a photo, for example, you could take it back to school, and then from that photo, draw a field sketch. Or you could do a site description, so describing what the site looks like, what is around, and so on. So these methods, however, can tend to be biased. So that's the disadvantage of using qualitative data, because they involve the judgment of the person that is collecting the data. So the other thing that we need to remember here is that we could be asked about the advantages of qualitative data collection, or qualitative data that we have collected, advantages and disadvantages, as well as advantages and disadvantages of quantitative data. Okay, so you're back in school now, and the next thing that you will need to do is to process and present your river fieldwork data. Now, obviously, this could be river fieldwork, or it could be coastal fieldwork, depending on which one you have done at school. So there are 4 things here that you will need to consider, or you will need to do rather. So the first thing is to arrange your data sheets in a logical way before you can start presenting that data. So the data may have been collected individually or collectively, and if it has been collected collectively, then everyone will need to bring their data together so that you can then collate that data, which is your second step here, and possibly record it on a spreadsheet. If it's a lot of data that you have, then it will be really important for you to put it on a spreadsheet. Then after that, you will need to select the data that you actually want to present. So some of the data may not be data that you actually want to present, and therefore you will need to decide or decipher through the data and decide which one it is that you want to use. And that data that you choose to use must be relevant to your investigation. It must be data that will actually help you answer that initial question that you set before, that you designed in the design phase of the investigation. And then the next step is to decide on what data presentation method you want to use. Now, it must be the method that best suits the type of data that you are presenting. And there are a wide variety to choose from. You can use bar charts, you can use line graphs, you can use pie charts, histograms, maps, GIS annotated photographs, field sketches, and data tables. So there's a wide range to choose from. But you have to consider when choosing from this one, from these here, which one best suits the data that you want to present. Okay, and then I've got an exam tip here. So ensure that you can remember at least 2 of the ways you use to present your data and the advantage of using that particular data presentation method. So if you used a bar graph, for example, why did you use it? And in terms of what the advantage of using the bar graph was. You could talk about how it best suits your data, for example, and then also try to think about what limitations that way of data presentation is likely to have as well. That could be a question as well that you may be asked. Okay, so once we have presented our data, the next thing that we will need to do is to analyze that data and draw our conclusions. So if you have used graphs to present your data, you will need to explain what the graphs show, right? And you can use GEOG to help you, GEOG. So this here is an acronym. It's based on the word geography, obviously, and it's GEOG. So G will stand for the general pattern that you can see on that particular graph or data. Okay, so does the trend show an increase or a decrease, for example, overall? And then and then we'll go on to the next bit, which is where now you use evidence from your data. You're using figures from that particular data as evidence for that particular general pattern. So for example, what's the highest and what's the lowest from that data that you can see? And ensure that you're making links between the different sets of data where possible. Okay. Then the O stands for outliers. Now, outliers here are anomalies, right? And if there is an unusual pattern, do not neglect to talk about it. Make sure that you actually include it, because it shows that you're being very candid and honest about the data that you have collected. So this is data. An outlier or an anomaly is data that does not fit with the rest of the data that you have collected, with the rest of the pattern that is being shown in that particular graph that you drew from your primary data. And then finally, the last G is a geographical explanation. And this is where you explain the reasons for the trend that you have identified in your data. So you can use your geographical understanding from your prior learning. For example, the Bradshaw model, you could make reference to that if your data is similar to what the Bradshaw model shows. If it's not similar, then think about reasons why that may not be the case. Okay, so let's carry on. So for quantitative data, you can use statistical techniques later on now in your analysis, not in later on, but in your analysis. So the statistical techniques that you can use are range, obviously mode, median, and quartiles. Okay, so like the middle number, the range, the highest and the smallest, the highest and the lowest, and so on. Or the mode, the one that occurs the most, depending on what type of data you will have collected. So qualitative data can be analyzed using detailed annotations and explanations. So qualitative data obviously now is slightly different because it doesn't involve numbers. So you're going to be annotating it, or giving explanations for why that data or information is showing what it does. So for example, if you collected field sketches, you're going to be highlighting the key things in that particular sketch that you want the reader to be able to see. Okay, so let's move on then to the conclusions then. So a conclusion obviously is where you are answering your investigation question or your inquiry question. If you had some questions and hypotheses, this is now your opportunity to explain whether your findings prove or disprove the hypothesis. So in other words, are they in line with the hypothesis that you had initially formulated, or are they not in line with the hypothesis that you had formulated? Anomalies must also be considered. And explanations and justifications must be made for those anomalies that you may find. And finally, you can explain the wider geographical importance of your investigation. So, for example, who might your study be useful to? So, for example, if you were doing a study in the lower course of a river, and it's about flooding, that study could be important for town planners for example, if they were deciding on building houses, for example, or infrastructure in that part of the town, or that you've gone to or close to that particular river. Then what impact is that infrastructure likely to have on the river? So if it's a river that is likely to flood, then your information that you collected or the data you collected could be helpful to those town planners. So you're thinking about the wider context of the data that you have collected. And then you could also talk about how your study could be extended. Okay, so if it was to be done again, then what could be done differently? Or what else did you not do in your investigation that could be, what is it that you did not do in your investigation that could be the subject of another geographical investigation, for example? All right, so lastly then, here there's an exam tip. So you may be asked to assess the strength of your conclusion first of all. That's something that I did not put here. So you could be asked to think about how strong you think your conclusions were. So obviously you would need to go back to the beginning of your investigation and go through the entire process and either say and say where the strengths were, or in line with the data that you collected, whether you think it provides a strong case based on the conclusion that you have made. Okay, and then also you may be asked to assess the strength of other people's conclusions. Now in this situation, you will be given other people's conclusions and the sets of data that they collected. It could be in tables or in graphs, and then you will need to say, based on the data they collected, whether the conclusion that they made was a strong conclusion or not. Okay, so yeah, that's just a tip I had put there. So let's carry on. So once you have analyzed and concluded on your data, you will then need to do an evaluation of your investigation. And this is where you reflect and think critically about the entire fieldwork investigation process. You must be extremely candid and identify any limitations or errors at any of the stages of the process, and how that may have affected the reliability of your results or findings. So there are several sources of error that you may want to consider. And the first one is the sampling method, frequency, and sample size. Okay, so was the sample method that you used the best one for the data that you are collecting, or would a different one have been more representative or more appropriate, right? So if systematic sampling was used, for example, was the frequency of the sample ideal? So how many times you collected that data? Was it 3 or 4 or twice? Okay, or should it have been different? So do you think that it would have been better to collect 7 data sets instead of 5? And also remember that it's always better to collect more data, because if you collect more data, it means then that you can do an average, and having more data sets from more data points will be a lot more reliable in terms of the primary data you have collected. So that's really, really important to remember. You actually could be asked that as an exam question, one of the shorter ones, where you're asked about how you could have improved the reliability of your data. And what to say there straight away is that you could have collected data from a few more sites, or more sites than just the 3 or 4 or 5 that you collected it from. Okay, so increased frequency, that's what I've said here. Increased frequency improves accuracy as more data is collected and you have a bigger sample size, hence that size will be a lot more representative. So another possible source of error could be the equipment that you used, as well as human error. So you will be asking yourself, what could have made your data inaccurate or unreliable, e.g. when using a stopwatch, or measuring tape, or stepping into the water and affecting the velocity of the water, and so on. So if you're using a stopwatch, the stopwatch could have been started a little later than when it could have been started, for example, and that could provide error within your unreliability. We could introduce unreliability to the data set that you will have collected as a result. Then the measuring tape, you need to think about whether it was actually straight enough, because if you are using tape, sometimes it slacks, and if it slacks, it may not give you a very accurate reading. So those are things that you need to be thinking about, and things that you need to be prepared to answer in the question, in the examination, in case you're asked about. Okay, and then the next possible source of error would come from the time of year when you collected that particular data, or the time of the day actually, and then the weather on that particular day. So different seasons, for example, are going to have different conditions. So if you go to that particular river in the summer, then the data may not be representative for the fall, or for the spring, or for the winter, right? So you'll need to think about that. And it is worth noting as well in your evaluation. Because if you go obviously during those other different times, you're likely to get your investigation could yield different results. Okay, and then sometimes you get weather that is not the typical weather that you would get at that particular time of the year. So if you get some kind of freak weather, then that may be a kind of an anomaly. Okay, and that can impact your results. Then we are also thinking about another possible source of error being the location of the survey. So in some cases, big variations in terms of the river characteristics can occur in locations that are actually close to each other. So differences in characteristics such as the depth and the width of the river, and that obviously could also be a source of error or unreliability in the results you're collecting. So then the last thing that could be a possible source of error is the quality of the secondary data that you have collected. So first of all, have you collected that data from a reliable source, right? And then is the data up to date? If it was collected quite a while back, then that is not likely to be as representative, because there's some of the features along that particular river are likely to have changed, right? So that's something else that you'd like to mention in terms of whether you think about in your evaluation and say whether you think that data was actually reliable or not. So as part of your evaluation, you can link these possible sources of error to your conclusions, right? And identify which conclusions are likely to be reliable and which ones are not likely to be reliable. So that's also really important, especially if you are asked, for example, to talk about whether you think your conclusions were reliable or they were not. Okay, and then I've put another exam tip here. You may be asked in an 8-marker to assess the reliability. Yes, the reliability of your conclusions, and these possible sources of error, yes, are a great point for you to use as key points. So please do remember these. So for the second fieldwork study that you did, it will either have been an urban field study or a rural field study, right? And in terms of the steps that you would go through as you plan your investigation, they are the same as the ones that we did for the physical part, and therefore we'll just skip through that and go on to the next slide. You can have a look at these, but they are similar to the ones that we did earlier. Okay, so for this human section, we are going to be using an urban investigation as our example. And obviously, again, we are developing an inquiry question, sub-questions, and hypotheses. So when developing an inquiry question for an urban study, some important questions to consider would be which places offer a better quality of life and why? And also to ask ourselves what processes or factors are likely to have caused those differences. And if we are talking about processes and factors, we could be talking about processes such as deindustrialization as an example, suburbanization, counter-urbanization, and so on. And the IMD is an important way of determining this. So that is the index of multiple deprivation. So this is an index that the government uses to determine what areas are deprived and which ones are not. And they use a couple of indices, they use 7 indices to determine that. So they use housing, they use income, they use access to healthcare and education and so on. So those will give you an idea as to what the reasons behind the differences that you see in that urban area are, for example. Okay. So what's an example then of an investigation question for an urban study? So an example would be, why does the quality of life differ in 2 areas of Stratford? So if you went to Stratford, for example, why does the quality of life differ in 2 different areas? So that would mean that you would need to go to different parts of Stratford and collect data from those different parts. And they must be parts that have differences in terms of the quality of life. Okay. And then again, because this is a broad question, we will need to break it down further into sub-questions. And in the sub-questions now is where the IMD may come in handy, because we may use some of those indices there or indicators in the IMD for our sub-questions. And our first sub-question here, for example, could be, how does the number and type of services differ? So in your 2 areas, which area out of the 2 has more services, and what is the difference in the types of services that there are in those 2 different areas? Okay, and then the other question you could do, you can use as a sub question is, how does the quality of the environment differ? Okay, and then thirdly, how does the level of crime differ? Right, so you then use your prior knowledge from your urban studies then to create hypotheses like we did for the river study. So your hypothesis, again, is a prediction of what you expect to find. For example, the hypothesis for our sub-questions here would be, there will be more and better services in East Village. So East Village is a part of Stratford. And then the one that is normally used as a comparison or to contrast it rather, is Carpenter's Estate, right? So Then the second hypothesis for the sub question would be there will be lower environmental quality in Carpenter's estate. So these are sub questions these are hypotheses for your sub questions, and they are what you predict or you expect to find when you go to Stratford, to those two particular areas in Stratford. So moving on to designing your inquiry. Qualitative data, quantitative data, and sampling methods. So we'll go on straight to sampling methods. Now again here, you have random sampling, which will mean that if you were to go to Carpenter's estate, which is one of the areas of Stratford, you just go to any part of Carpenter's estate and collect data there. Now that removes bias, but the problem with that is that it might not be representative of the entire area of Carpenter's estate. And then we have systematic sampling, and then this here again works on a system, so every 5 meters or every 10 meters, so it removes bias, but again may not necessarily be representative. Then we have stratified sampling, which is where you're collecting data from different parts. So you could go to the residential part of both areas that you're studying, because you're studying two different areas to see how they compare and contrast. And therefore, in each of the two areas, if you go to their residential parts, what are they like? You collect data from there. And then to their commercial areas, or where you are likely to have shops or whatever, where there's retail, you can go there for both parts and then collect data from either 3 areas within that particular area that you've located, within your residential area or within your commercial area. Okay, so those are the sampling methods that you could use. And then in terms of examples of quantitative data that you could collect. Now I have done that as a table here, and so you have the examples of the quantitative data and what is needed and how you do it. Okay, so one of the things you could collect is a service data for is do a service tally, right? So you will need to have a pre-prepared table with a range of services to look out for, and then tally as you walk through that particular area, okay, in your two contrasting areas. So so types of services, so is it a hair salon, is it convenience stores, you tally them as you go along, and then eventually you'll count how many number of those different types of services you have in the two different areas. Then secondly, you could do an environmental quality survey, right? So this is where it's also again pre-prepared with a range of indicators to score at different points in those two contrasting areas, right? So in terms of if you're talking about the quality of the environment, you could be talking about litter, you could give it a score of 1 to 5 and so on. And then lastly, you can the last one rather is local or visitor coded questionnaire. So this here will be a questionnaire with closed questions and specific answers. So this one here, people will give you specific answers and then you'll record them. And then eventually when you get back to school, you can collate them and put them into graphs. Then in terms of qualitative data, again, you could do field sketches, take photos, videos, and then do site descriptions, and you also have interviews where you could, where you will need a pre-prepared questionnaire as well. Okay, so we are moving on to the structure of the paper 2 exam. Now I know that we have passed or we've skipped the data presentation part, the analysis and conclusions part, and also the evaluating part, and that's because it's similar to the one that we did for the river study. So if you want to refresh your memory on that, you can just go back to the to earlier in the video and have a look at that. But then moving on to the exam, I've based this information here on the 2024 paper. And obviously paper 2 is UK geographical issues, and it's 1.5 hours like paper 1 was. And the total mark allocation again is 94 marks, and 4 marks will be for SPAG, so spelling, punctuation and grammar. So section A, B and C, so 3 parts, and the first one is on UK's evolving physical landscape. So we've done a video on this if you want to go and have a look at that to remind yourself, if you are not aware that we've done one. And it's going to have 4 different sections, and in the first section it will just be general questions on the UK's evolving landscape, and those will be worth 5 marks. Well, they were last year. And then coastal change will be the next section, and that will be worth 8 marks. Then rivers and the river processes will be 6 marks. And then there'll also be an 8-mark question, which is likely to be either an evaluate or assess question, which has a resource. Now, it's very important for me to remind you here that you need to use that resource. If you find a resource in the exam, in one of the exam questions, you must reference that resource. So what I will do once I get the paper, and well, not once I get the paper, but when I get to the question and I've read the question and understood it and know that I have to use the resource, is then to go to the resource and annotate the key information, or highlight at least the key information that I think I will need to use in my answer, right? So that as I write my answer, I'm looking back to the resource to get my information from there as well, and to reference it and to use data from that resource. That will give you additional marks. So that's going to be really important. And last year there was a bar graph as a resource and a table showing flooding in the UK, and it was an assessed question. Then we've got section B, which is UK's evolving human landscapes. And then here again we had 7 marks, which were like structured questions. So they were okay. So actually, let me just backtrack just a little bit. So these 7 marks here on section B, these 5 marks, these 8 marks, and these 6 marks here are based on either, well, there will be amongst those questions some multiple choice questions, all right, but not that many, 1 or 2 from section for one for section A and 1 for section B. And then you'll also have 2-mark questions. You're also likely to have 3-mark questions, and then you're also likely to have 4-mark questions. Now, one thing that I must emphasize, and I really want you to remember, is that for the explain questions, you have to explain. So you write a reason, and then you explain that reason, because if you don't explain, you're losing half the marks for a 2-marker, for example, because the reason will get a tick, and then the explanation, if there's none, there's no tick for it, and that's losing 50% of the marks. So please make sure that you are explaining. Then for the 3-mark questions, you write down 1 reason, 2 explanations, or 2 developments. Then for the 4-mark questions, you're likely to be asked for 2 things, or 2 reasons rather. So you write down 1 reason, an explanation, and a 2nd reason and an explanation. Or you could be given a 4-mark where you need to write 1 reason and 3 developments or 3 explanations. Well, 3 developments, okay? Then going back now to section B then, investigating a geographical issue will be the 8-mark question here, and this one is likely to have the 4 marks for SPAG. Now in last year's paper, it was a population pyramid, and I don't know why I wrote that here, but I remember it. Yeah, sorry, it was a population pyramid that was showing rural and urban populations of the UK. I remember now, and that was an assessed question. Okay, so obviously this year it's likely that it's not going to be a pyramid, population pyramid, but it's just good for reference purposes. Okay, and then we have section C. So section C now is the one that is on the fieldwork investigations. So what we have been covering in this particular video. And in this section C here, you will have section C1 and C2. So C1 will be the physical study, So it will either be rivers or coasts, depending on which one you do at your school, right? And then in section C2, again, you will need to choose one. Did I say that for section 1? Sorry, for section C1, sorry. So C1, you will have one on rivers, a question on rivers, and then another question, a section on coastal change. So you will need to choose from these two. So decide whether you're doing rivers or coastal change, depending on what you have done at your school, what field study investigation you did. Okay, I hope that is clear. And then you have section C2. Again, here you will need to choose one, and this is the human part, or the human environment, and you will need to choose either urban areas or rural areas and answer the questions from either one of those. And each of these is going to be 18 marks. So here in this section, we are going to be talking about some of the common questions that are asked in section C. And section C, obviously, of paper 2 is the geographical investigations part of it, right? So these are just for you to think about, okay? And they're just here randomly. There's no particular order. They're just common questions that are asked. So the first one is your fieldwork location, right? So for that question, you're likely to say where you collected your data from or where you went for your fieldwork, right? So example, Stratford, London, or Epping Forest, Essex, right? Then the second question is your fieldwork question and why you chose it. So make sure that you can remember your inquiry question for both the human study investigation and the physical study investigation. And then the next question you could be asked is the data collection methods you used and why. Okay, what data did you collect, and where did you collect that data from? So what sites did you go to? Why did you go to those particular sites? So talk about your sampling methods maybe, right? Why did you go to them, and how did you collect the data, right? So if you're measuring the river velocity, for example, for your physical study, you can talk about using maybe a cork, because most people use a cork and a meter stick, or a meter rule, right? And then and a stopwatch rather, and then you place the cork, or you drop it onto the river, and then when it gets to where the meter rule begins, somebody starts the stopwatch. Then when it gets to the end of the meter rule, you stop the stopwatch, and then it gives you the time that it took for that cork to travel that distance, right? So that is something that you could describe, okay? Then the next thing here is, so what data did you collect, where, so the sites, why and how, and then what methods did you use to present your data and why, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of using those methods of data presentation. So did you use a bar chart? Did you use a pie chart? Okay, did you do a field sketch? All right, and so on. So the next question, so did your conclusions from your data prove or disprove the hypotheses that you made for your key questions, right? So you think about, whether the hypotheses that you'd come up with for your key questions or sub questions actually prove or disprove your hypothesis. Then primary and secondary data sources, which ones did you use? Were they useful? And then also you could be asked to analyze someone else's data and explain reasons or justifications for why they collected the data and where they collected that data from, and so on. And then also what conclusions are they likely to have made from that data and why, okay? Then you have sampling methods. So why you used one particular sampling method and not the other? What were the advantages of using that sampling method? Did you use stratified? Did you use random? or did you use systematic, and why, and what were the advantages and disadvantages? You could be asked about quantitative or qualitative data, the advantages or disadvantages of those. And then you could also be asked to assess the reliability of somebody else's conclusions or even your own conclusion. Okay. And then the reliability of your fieldwork data collection methods. Okay, so this is just questions that I'm putting out there for you to think about, so that you can make sure that you can answer them if they were to show up in the examination. I hope that you have found this video useful. I will be posting the ones for paper 3 soon. I would like to take this opportunity to wish you the best in your forthcoming exam. Please do let me know how you get on. And once again, all the best in the exam. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye-bye.